To the world at large, of course, it was just another day. A different sort entirely, at different places on the great, round, rolling earth. But nothing out of the ordinary. It was Tuesday on one side of the dateline and Monday on the other. It was so-and-so's wedding anniversary and so-and-so's birthday, and another so-and-so would get out of jail today. It was warm, it was cool, it was fair, it was cloudy. One looked forward to the future with confidence, with hope, with uneasiness, or with terror, according to one's temperament and one's geographical location and past history. To most of the human race, this was nothing whatever but just another day. But to Joe Kenmore, it was a most particular day indeed. Here, it was the gray hour just before sunrise, and already there were hints of reddish colorings in the sky. It was chilly, and somehow the world seemed still and breathless. To Joe, the feeling of tensity marked this morning off from all other mornings of his experience. He got up and began to dress, in Major Holt's quarters back of the giant steel half-globe called the Shed, near the town of Bootstrap. He felt queer because he felt so much as usual. By all the rules, he should have experienced a splendid, noble resolution and a fiery exultation, and perhaps even an admirable sensation of humility and unworthiness to accomplish what was expected of him today. And deep enough inside, he felt suitable emotion. But it happened that he couldn't take time to feel things adequately today. He was much more aware that he wanted some coffee rather badly, and that he hoped everything would go all right. He looked out of the windows at empty, dreary desert under the dawn sky. Today was the day he'd be leaving on a rather important journey. He hoped that Haney and the Chief and Mike weren't nervous. He also hoped that nobody had gotten at the fuel for the pushpots, and that the slide rule crew that had calculated everything hadn't made any mistakes. He was also bothered about the steering rocket fuel, and he was uncomfortable about the business of releasing the spaceship from the launching cage. There was, too, cause for worry in the takeoff rockets. If the tube linings had shrunk, there would be some rather gruesome consequences. And there could always be last-minute orders from Washington to delay or even cancel everything. In short, his mind was full of strictly practical details. He didn't have time to feel noble aspirations or sensations of high destiny. He had a very tricky and exacting job ahead of him. The sky was growing lighter outside. The stars faded in a paling blue, and the desert showed faint colorings. He tied his necktie. A deep-toned keening set up off to the southward, over the sere and dreary landscape. It was a faraway noise, something like the lament of a mountain-sized calf bleating for its mother. Joe took a deep breath. He looked, but saw nothing. The noise, though, told him that there'd be no cancellation of orders so far. He mentally uncrossed one pair of fingers. He couldn't possibly cross fingers against all foreseeable disasters. There weren't enough fingers, or toes either. But it was good that so far the schedule had held. He went downstairs. Major Holt was pacing up and down the living room of his quarters. Electric lights burned, but already the windows were brightening. Joe straightened up and tried to look casual. Strictly speaking, Major Holt was a family friend who happened also to be security officer here, in charge of protecting what went on in the giant construction shed. He'd had a sufficiently difficult time of it in the past, and the difficulties might keep on in the future. He was also the ranking officer here, and consequently the immediate boss of Joe's enterprise. Today's affair was still highly precarious. The whole thing was controversial and uncertain, and might spoil the career of somebody with stars on his collar if it should fail. so nobody in the high brass wanted the responsibility. If everything went well, somebody suitable would take credit and the bows. Meanwhile, Major Holt was boss by default. He looked sharply at Joe. "Morning." "Good morning, sir," said Joe. Major Holt's daughter Sally had a sort of understanding with Joe, but the Major hadn't the knack of cordiality, and nobody felt too much at ease with him. Besides, Joe was wearing a uniform for the first time this morning. There were only 8 such uniforms in the world so far. It was black whipcord with an Eisenhower jacket, narrow silver braid on the collar and cuffs, and a silver rocket for a badge, where a plane pilot wears his wings. It was strictly practical. Against accidental catchings in machinery, the trousers were narrow and tucked into 10-inch soft leather boots, and the wide leather belt had flat loops for the attachment of special equipment. Its width was a brace against the strains of acceleration. Sally had had much to do with its design. But it hadn't been decided by the Pentagon whether the space exploration project would be taken over by the Army, or the Navy, or the Air Corps. So Joe wore no insignia of rank. Technically, he was still a civilian. The deep-toned noise to the south had become a howl, sweeping closer and trailed by other howlings. "The pushpots are on the way over, as you can hear," said the Major detachedly in the curious light of daybreak and electric bulbs together. "Your crew is up and about. So far, there seems to be no hitch. You're feeling all right for the attempt today?" "If you want the truth, sir, I'd feel better with about 10 years practical experience behind me. But my gang and myself, we've had all the training we can get without an actual takeoff. We're the best trained crew to try it. I think we'll manage." "I see," said the Major. "You'll do your best." "We may have to do better than that," admitted Joe wryly. "True enough, you may." The Major paused. "You're well aware that there are, people who do not altogether like the idea of the United States possessing an artificial satellite of Earth." "I ought to know it," admitted Joe. The Earth's second man-constructed moon, out in space for just 6 weeks now, didn't seem nowadays like the bitterly contested achievement it actually was. From Earth, it was merely a tiny speck of light in the sky, identifiable for what it was only because it moved so swiftly and serenely from the sunset toward the east, or from the night's darkness into the dawn light. But it had been fought bitterly before it was launched. It was first proposed to the United Nations, but even discussion in the Council was vetoed. So the United States had built it alone. Yet the nations which objected to it as an international project liked it even less as a national one, and they'd done what they could to wreck it. The building of the great steel hull, now out there in emptiness, had been fought more bitterly by more ruthless and more highly trained saboteurs than any other enterprise in history. There had been 2 attempts to blast it with atomic bombs, but it was high aloft, rolling grandly around the Earth, so close to its primary that its period was little more than 4 hours, and it rose in the west and set in the east 6 times a day. Today, Joe would try to get a supply ship up to it, a very small, rocket-driven cargo ship named Pelican 1. The crew of the platform needed food and air and water, and especially the means of self-defense. Today's takeoff would be the first attempt at a rocket lift to space. "The enemies of the platform haven't given up," said the Major formidably. "And they used spectroscopes on the platform's rocket fumes. Apparently, they've been able to duplicate our fuel." Joe nodded. Major Holt went on. "For more than a month, military intelligence has been aware that rockets were under construction behind the Iron Curtain. They will be guided missiles, and they will carry atomic bomb heads. One or more may be finished any day. When they're finished, you can bet that they'll be used against the platform, and you will carry up the first arms for the platform. Your ship carries half a dozen long-range interceptor rockets to handle any attack from Earth. It's vitally important for them to be delivered. "They'll attack the platform?" demanded Joe angrily. "That's war." "Not if they deny guilt," said the Major ironically. "And if we have nothing to gain by war. The platform is intended to defend the peace of the world. If it is destroyed, we won't defend the peace of the world by going to war over it. But while the platform can defend itself, it is not likely that anyone will dare to make war. So you have a very worthwhile mission. I suggest that you have breakfast and report to the shed. I am on my way there now." Joe said, "Yes, sir." The Major started for the door. Then he stopped. He hesitated and said abruptly, "If my security measures have failed, Joe, you'll be killed. If there has been sabotage or carelessness, it will be my fault." "I'm sure, sir, that everything anybody can do to destroy you has been done," said the Major grimly. "Not only sabotage, Joe, but blunders and mistakes and stupidities. That always happens. But I've done my best. I suspect I'm asking your forgiveness if my best hasn't been good enough."
"What's going on?" he asked. "The System States Alliance in business again?" Karski laughed. "Oh, that's the Colonel's idea. Green and black were his colors in the war, and he's in command of the regiment." "Regiment? You need a whole regiment?" Khan asked. "Well, it's 2 companies, each about the size of a regular army platoon, but we have to call it a regiment so he can keep his old rebel army rank." "We could use a regiment, Khan," Tom Brangwyn said seriously. "You have no idea how bad things have gotten. Over on the East Coast, the outlaws are looting whole towns. About 4 months ago, they sacked Waterville, burned the whole town and killed close to 100 people. That was Blackie Paralis' gang." "Who is this Blackie Paralis? I heard the name mentioned in connection with the Harriet Barn." "Blackie Paralis is anybody the planetary government can't catch, which means practically any outlaw," Fred Karski said. "No, Fred, there is a Blackie Paralis," Tom Brangwyn said. "He used to be a planter, down in the South. The banks foreclosed on him when he couldn't pay his notes, and he turned outlaw. That's the way it's going, all around. Every time a planter loses his plantation, or a farmer loses his farm, or a mechanic loses his job, he turns outlaw. Take Tramptown here. We used to plant nothing but melons. Then, when the sale for wine and brandy dropped, the melon planters began cutting their melon crops and raising produce, instead of buying it from up north, and turning land into pasture for cattle. The people we used to buy foodstuffs from couldn't sell all they raised, and that threw a lot of farmhands out of work. So they got the idea there was work here, and they came flocking in, and when they couldn't get jobs, they just stayed in Tramptown, stealing anything they could. We don't even try to police Tramptown anymore. We just see to it they don't come up here." "Well, where do these outlaws and pirates who are looting whole towns come from?" "Down in the Badlands, mostly. None of them have been bothering us since we organized the Home Guard. They tried to a couple of times at first. There may have been a few survivors. They spread it around that Gordon Valley wasn't any outlaw's health resort." "Why don't you join us, Khan?" Fred Karski asked. "All our old gang belong." "I'd like to, but I'm afraid I'm going to be kind of busy." Brangwyn nodded. "Yes, you will be at that," he agreed. "So I hear," Fred Karski said. "Do you really know where it is, Khan?" "Well, no. He went into the routine about Merlin being still classified triple-top secret. But we'll find it. It may take time, but we will." They talked for a while. He asked more questions about the Home Guard. His father, it seemed, had donated all the equipment. They had 170 men on the active list, but they had a reserve of over 800, and combat vehicles and weapons on all the plantations and in all the towns along the river. The reserve had only been turned out twice. Both times, outlaw attacks had been stopped dead, literally. The Home Guard, it appeared, was not given to making arrests or taking prisoners. Finally, he parted from them, strolling on along the row of stores and business places, many vacant, under the south edge of the mall, until he saw a Fluorolite sign. Wade Lucas, M.D. He entered. Lucas wasn't busy. They went into his consultation office, and Khan took off his gun belt and hung it up. Lucas offered cigarettes, and they lighted and sat down. "I see you've started carrying one," he said, nodding to the pistol Khan had laid aside. "Civic obligation. I'm going to be too busy for Home Guard duty, but if I can protect myself, it'll save somebody else the job of protecting me. Maybe if there weren't so many guns around, there wouldn't be so much trouble." He felt his good opinion of Wade Lucas start to slip. The liberals on Terra had been full of that kind of talk, which was why only 4 out of 10 of last year's graduating class at Armed Forces Academy had been able to get active commissions. The last war had been a disaster, so don't prepare for another one. When it comes, let it be a worse disaster. Guns don't make trouble. People make trouble. If the troublemakers are armed, you have to be armed too. When did you last see an air patrol boat around here? Or even a constabulary trooper? All we have here is the Home Guard, and Tom Brangwyn and 3 deputies, and his pay and theirs is always 6 months in arrears. Lucas nodded. A bankrupt government, an unemployment rate that rises every year, currency that buys less every month, and do-it-yourself justice. The doctor blew a smoke ring and watched it float toward the ventilator intake. "You said you're going to be busy. This company your father's talking about organizing?" "That's right. You're going to be at the meeting at the academy this afternoon, aren't you?" "Yes. Just what are you going to do after you get it organized?" "Well, I brought back information on a great deal of undiscovered equipment and stores that the Third Forces left behind." He talked on for some time, keeping to safe generalities. "It's too big for my father and me to handle alone, even if we didn't feel morally obligated to take in the people who contributed toward sending me to school on Terra. You ought to be interested in it. I know of 6 fully supplied hospitals, intended to take care of the casualties in case of a system state space attack. You can imagine, better than I can, what would be in them. Yes, medical supplies of all sorts are getting hard to find. But look here, you're not going to let those people waste time looking for this alleged computer, this thing they call Merlin, are you? We're looking for any valuable war material. I don't know the location of Merlin, but I'll bet you don't," Lucas said vehemently. That was the same thing Flora had said. "But Merlin is undoubtedly the most valuable item of abandoned TF equipment on this planet. In the long run, I'd say more valuable than everything else together. We certainly aren't going to ignore it." "Good heavens, Khan, you aren't like these people here. You were educated at the University of Montevideo." "So I was. I studied computer theory and practice. I have some doubts about Merlin being able to do some of the things these laymen like Kelton and Fawsey and Judge Ledoux think it could. Those sorts of misconceptions and exaggerations have to be allowed for. But I have no doubt whatever that the master computer with which they did their strategic planning is probably the greatest mechanism of its sort ever built. And I have no doubt whatever that it still exists somewhere in the Alpha system." He almost convinced himself of it. He did not, however, convince Wade Lucas, who was now regarding him with narrow-eyed suspicion. You mean you categorically state that the computer actually exists. That, I think, was the general idea. Yes, I certainly do believe that Merlin exists. Maybe he was telling the truth. Merlin existed in the beliefs and hopes of people like Dolph Kelton and Clem Zareth, and Judge Ledoux and Kurt Fawsey. Merlin was a god to them. Well, take Gu, the Thorin grandfather god. Gu was as preposterous theologically as Merlin was technologically. Gu, except to Thorins, was a Federation-wide joke. But he'd known a couple of Thorins at the university, funny little fellows, with faces like terriers, their bodies covered with matted black hair. They believed in Gu the way we believed in the second law of thermodynamics. Gu is with them every moment of their lives. Take away their belief in Gu, and they would have been lost and wretched. As lost and wretched as Kurt Fawsey or Judge Ledoux if they lost their belief in Merlin. He was starting to say something like that, and then thought better of it. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus.
Though down, the savages soon discovered that Stevens was not out. In such close quarters, he could not use his sword, but the 14-inch blade of the dirk, needle-pointed as it was, with two razor-sharp serrated cutting edges, was itself no mean weapon, and time after time he drove it deep, taking life at every thrust. 4 more red monsters threw themselves upon the prostrate man, but not sufficiently versed in armor to seek out its joints, their fierce short spear thrusts did no damage. Presently, 4 more corpses lay still, and Stevens, with his, to them, incredible earthly strength, was once more upon his feet in spite of their utmost efforts to pinion his mighty limbs, and was again swinging his devastating weapon. Half their force lying upon the field, wiped out by a small but invincible and apparently invulnerable being, the remainder broke and ran, pursued by Stevens to the point where the red monsters had first halted. He recovered his arrows and returned to the cave, opening his faceplate as he came. "All X, sweetheart?" he asked, rolling away the boulders. "Didn't get anything through to you, did they?" "No, they didn't even realize that I was taking part in the battle, I guess. Did they hurt you while you were down? I was scared to death for a minute." "No, the old armor held. One of them must have gnawed on my ankle some, between the greave and the heel plate, but he couldn't quite get through. It's a darn small opening there, too. Must have bent my foot way round to get in at all. Have to tighten that joint up a little, I guess. I'll bet I've got a black spot and a blue spot there the size of my hand. Maybe it's only the size of yours, though. You won't die of that, probably. Heavens, Steve, that cleaver of yours is a frightful thing in action. Suppose it's safe for us to go home?" "Absolutely. Right now is the best chance we'll ever have, and something tells me that we'd better make it snappy. They'll be back, and the next time they won't be so easy to take." "All X, then. Hold me, Steve. I can't stand the sight of that, let alone wade through it. I'm going to faint or something, sure." "As you were," he snapped. "You aren't going to pass out now that it's all over. It's a pretty ghastly mess, I know. But shut your eyes, and I'll carry you out of sight." "Aren't we out of sight of that place yet?" she demanded after a time. "I have been for quite a while," he confessed. "But you're sitting pretty, aren't you? And you aren't very heavy. Not here on Ganymede, anyway." "Put me down," she commanded. "After that crack, I won't play with you anymore at all. I'll pick up my marbles and go home." He released her, and they hurried back toward their waterfall, keeping wary eyes sharp, set for danger in any form, animal or vegetable. On the way back across the foothills, Stephen shot another hexapet, and upon the plateau above the river, Nadia bagged several birds and small animals. But it was not until they were actually in their own little canyon that their rapid pace slackened and their vigilance relaxed. "After this, Ace, we hunt together, and we go back to wearing armor while we're hunting. It scared me out of a year's growth when you checked up missing." "We sure do, Steve," she concurred emphatically. "I'm not going to get more than a meter away from you from now on. What do you suppose those horrible things are?" "Which?" "Both. Those flowers aren't like anything Tellus ever saw, so we have no basis of comparison. They may be a development of a fly-catching plant, or they may be a link between the animal and vegetable kingdom. However, we don't intend to study them, so let's forget them. Those animals were undoubtedly intelligent beings. They probably are a race of savages of this satellite." "Then the really civilized races are probably—" "Not necessarily. There may well be different types, each struggling towards civilization. They certainly are on Venus, and they once were on Mars." "Why haven't we seen anything like that before, in all these months? Things have been so calm and peaceful that we thought we had the whole world to ourselves, as far as danger or men are concerned." "We never saw them before because we never went where they lived. You were a long ways from your usual stamping grounds, you know. That animal-vegetable flower is probably a high-altitude organism, living in the mountains and never coming as low as we are down here. As for the savages, whatever they are, they probably never come within 5 kilometers of the falls. Many primitive peoples think that waterfalls are inhabited by demons, and maybe these folks are afflicted the same way. We don't know much about our new world yet, do we?" "We sure don't, and I'm not particularly keen on finding out much more about it until we get organized for trouble either." "Well, here we are. Just like getting back home to see the Hope, isn't it?" "It is home, and will be until we get one of our own on Earth." And after Stevens had read his meters, learning with satisfaction that the full current was still flowing into the accumulators, he began to cut up the meat. "Now that you've got the power plant running at last, what next?" asked Nadia, piling the cuts in the freezer. "Brandon's ultra radio comes next, but it's got more angles to it than a cubist's picture of a set of prisms. So many that I don't know where to begin. There, that job's done. Let's sit down and I'll talk at you a while. Maybe between us we can figure out where to start. I've got everything to build it lined up except for the tube, but that's got me stopped cold. You see, fields of force are all right in most places, but I've got to have one tube, and it's got to have the hardest possible vacuum. That means a mercury vapor super pump. Mercury is absolutely the only thing that will do the trick, and the mercury is one thing that is conspicuous by its absence in these parts. So are tungsten for filaments, tantalum for plates, and platinum for leads. And I haven't found anything that I can use as a getter either. A metal, you know, to flash inside the tube to clean up the last traces of atmosphere in it. I didn't suppose that such a simple thing as a radio tube could hold you up, after the perfectly unbelievable things that you've done already. But I see now how it could. Of course, the tubes in our receiver over there are too small." "Yes, they are only receiver and communicator tubes, and I need a high-power transmitting tube, a 50-kilowatter at least. I'd give my left leg to the knee joint for one of those big, water-cooled 60-kilowatt 1019s right now. It would save us a lot of grief." "Maybe you could break up those tubes and use the plates and so on." "I thought of that, but it won't work. There isn't half enough metal in the lot, and the filaments in particular are so tiny that I couldn't possibly work them over into a big one. Then, too, we haven't got many spare tubes, and if I smash the ones we're using, I put our communicators out of business for good, so that we can't yell for help if we have to drift home. And I still don't get any mercury." "Do you mean to tell me there's no mercury on this whole planet?" "Not exactly, but I do mean that I haven't been able to find any, and that it's probably darn scarce. And since all the other metals I want worst are also very dense and of high atomic weight, they're probably mighty scarce here too. Why? Because we're on a satellite, and no matter what hypothesis you accept for the origin of satellites, you come to the same conclusion, that heavy metals are either absent or most awfully scarce and buried deep down toward the center. There are lots of heavy metals in Jupiter somewhere, but we probably couldn't find them. Jupiter's atmosphere is one mass of fog, and we couldn't see, since we haven't got an infrared transformer. I could build one, in time, but it would take quite a while, and we couldn't work on Jupiter anyway, because of its gravity, and probably because of its atmosphere. And even if we could work there, we don't want to spend the rest of our lives prospecting for Mercury. Stevens fell silent, brow wrinkled in thought. You mean, dear, that we're... Nadia broke off, the sentence unfinished. Gosh, no. There's lots of things not tried yet, and we can always set out to drift it. I was thinking only of building the tube. And I'm trying to think. Say, Nadia, what do you know about Cantrell's comet? Not a thing, except that I remember reading in the newspapers that it was peculiar for something or other. But what has Cantrell's comet got to do with the high cost of living? Or with radio tubes? Have you gone cuckoo all of a sudden? You'll be surprised. Stevens grinned at her puzzled expression. Cantrell's comet is one of Jupiter's comet family, and is peculiar in being the most massive one known to science. It was hardly known until after they built those 1,000-foot reflectors on the moon, where the seeing is always perfect. But it has been studied a lot since then. Its nucleus is small, but extremely heavy. It seems to have an average density of somewhere around 16. There's platinum and everything else that's heavy there, girl. They ought to be there in such quantity that even such a volunteer chemist as I am could find them. Heavens, Steve! A look of alarm flashed over Nadia's face, then disappeared as rapidly as it had come into being. But, of course, comets aren't really dangerous. Sure not. A comet's tail, which so many people are afraid of as being poison gas, is almost a perfect vacuum, even at its thickest, and we'd have to wear spacesuits anyway. And speaking of vacuum, whoopee! We don't need Mercury any more than a goldfish needs a gas mask. When we get Mr. Tube done, we'll take him out into space, leaving his mouth open, and very shortly he'll be as empty as a flapper's skull. Then we'll seal him up, flash him out, come back here, and start spilling our troubles into brand and shell-like ear. Wonderful, Steve. You do get an idea occasionally, don't you? But how do we get out there? Where is this Cantrell's comet? I don't know exactly. There's one rub. Another is that I haven't even started the transmitter and receptor units. But we've got some field generators here on board that I can use, so it won't be so bad. And our comet is in this part of the solar system, somewhere fairly close. Wish we had an ephemeris, a couple of IP solar charts, and a real telescope. You can't do much without an ephemeris, I should think. It's a good thing you kept the chronometers going. You know the IP time, day, and dates anyway. I'll have to do without some things, that's all. And the man stared absently at the steel wall. I remember something about its orbit, since it is one thing that all IP vessels have to steer clear of. Think I can figure it close enough so that we'll be able to find it in our little telescope, or even on our plate, since we'll be out of this atmosphere. And it might not be a bad idea for us to get away anyway. I'm afraid of those folks on that spaceship, whoever they are, and they must live around here somewhere. Cantrell's comet swings about 50 million kilometers outside Jupiter's orbit at aphelion, close enough for us to reach, and yet probably too far for them to find us easily. By the time we get back here, they probably will have quit looking for us, if they look at all. Then, too, I expect these savages to follow us up. What say, little ace? Do we try it, or do we stay here? You know best, Steve. As I said before, I'm with you from now on, in whatever you think best to do. I know that you think it best to go out there. Therefore, so do I. Well, he said finally, I'd better get busy then. There's a lot to do before we can start. The radio doesn't come next, after all. The transmitter and receptor units come ahead of it. They won't mean wasted labor in any event, since we'll have to have them in case the radio fails. You'd better lay in a lot of supplies while I'm working on that stuff, but don't go out of sight, and yell like fury if you see anything. We'd both better wear full armor every time we go out of doors. Unless I'm all out of control, we aren't done with those savages yet. Even though they may be afraid of the demons of the falls, I think they'll have at least one more try at us. While Nadia brought in meat and vegetables and stored them away, Stevens attacked the problem of constructing the pair of tight beam, auto-dirigible transmitter and receptor units, which would connect his great turbo alternator to the accumulators of their craft, wherever it might be in space. From the force field generators of the Forlorn Hope, he selected the two most suitable for his purpose, tuned them to the exact frequency he required, and around them built a complex system of condensers and coils. But he knew it was accidental on Terry's part. He would hold no grudge. "Just why," asked Terry measuredly, "did you come here to offer to drive me somewhere? Is there any special reason to want me to get out of town?" "That is not it," said Horta. "It could be wished that you would take a certain course of action. Yes, but not because you would be absent from here. It is because you would be present at a special other place."
Nothing was further from my mind when I discovered the release drug, Relin, than the realization that it would lead me through as strange and ghastly and revealing a series of adventures as any man has ever experienced. I encountered it, in a way, as a mere byproduct of my experiments. I am a chemist by profession, and as one of the staff of the Morgenstern Foundation have access to some of the best equipped laboratories in America. The startling new invention, I must call it that, though I did not create it deliberately, came to me in the course of my investigations into the obscure depths of the human personality. It has long been my theory that there is, in man, a psychic entity which can exist for at least brief periods apart from the body and have perceptions which are not those of the physical senses. In accordance with these views, I have been developing various drugs, compounded of morphine and adrenaline, whose object was to shock the psychic entity loose for limited periods and so to widen the range and powers of the personality. I shall not go into the details of my researches, nor tell by what accident I succeeded better than I had hoped. The all-important fact, a fact so overwhelming that I shudder and gasp and marvel, even as I tell of it, is that I did obtain a minute quantity of a drug which, by putting the body virtually in a state of suspended animation, could release the mind to travel almost at will across time and space. Yes, across time and space, for the drag of the physical having been stricken off, I could enter literally into infinity and eternity. But let me tell precisely what happened that night, when at precisely 10:08 in the solitude of my apartment room, I swallowed half an ounce of Relin and stretched myself out on the bed, well knowing that I was taking incalculable risks and that insanity and even death were by no means remote possibilities of the road ahead. But let that be as it may, in my opinion, there is no coward more despicable than he who will not face danger for the sake of knowledge. My head reeled and something seemed to buzz inside it as soon as the bitter half-ounce of fluid slipped down my throat. I was barely able to reach the bed and throw myself upon it when there came a snapping as of something inside my brain. Then, for a period, blankness. Then a gradual awakening with that feeling of exhilaration one experiences only after the most blissful sleep. I opened my eyes, feeling strong and light of limb, and charged with a marvelous vital energy, but as I peered about me, my lips drew far apart in astonishment, and I am sure that I gaped like one who has seen a ghost. Where were the familiar walls of my 2x4 room, the bureau, the book rack, the ancient portrait of Pasteur that hung in its glass frame just above the foot of the bed? Gone! Vanished as utterly as though they had never been. I was standing on a wide and windy plain with the gale beating in my ears and with rapid sunset-colored clouds scudding across the blood-stained west. Mingled with the wailing of the blast, there was a deep sobbing sound that struck me in successive waves, like the ululations of great multitudes of far-off mourners. And while I was wondering what this might mean and felt a prickling of horror along my spine, the first of the portents swept across the sky. I say portents, for I do not know by what other term to describe the apparitions. High in the heavens, certainly at an altitude of many miles, the flaming things swept across my view, comet-shaped and stretching over at least 10 degrees of arc. Swift as a meteor, brilliantly flesh-red, sputtering sparks like an anvil, and leaving behind it a long, ruddy trail that only slowly faded out amid the darkening skies. It must have been a full minute after its disappearance before the hissing of its flight came to my ears, a hissing so sharp, so nastily insistent that it reached me even above the noise of the wind, and more than another minute had passed before the earth beneath me was wrenched and jarred as if by an earthquake, and the most thunderous detonations I had ever heard burst over me in a prolonged series. Let me emphasize that none of this had the quality of a dream. It was clear-cut, as vivid as anything I had ever experienced. My mind worked with an unusual precision and clarity, and not even a fleeting doubt came to me of the reality of my observations. This is some sort of bombing attack, I remember reflecting, some assault of supermonsters of the skies, perfected by a super science. And I did not have to be told the fact. I knew, as by an all-illuminating inner knowledge, that I had voyaged into the future. Even as this realization came to me, I made another flight, and one that was in space more than in time. It did not surprise me, but I took it as the most natural thing in the world when I seemed to rise and go floating away through the air. It was still sunset time, but I could see clearly enough as I went drifting at a height of several hundred yards above a vast, desolated space near the junction of two rivers. Perhaps, however, desolated is not the word I should use. I should say, rather, shattered, pulverized, obliterated, for a scene of more utter and hopeless ruin I have never seen nor imagined. Over an area of many square miles there was nothing but heaps and mounds of broken stone, charred and crumbling brick, fire-scarred timbers, and huge contorted masses of rustling steel like the decaying bones of superhuman monsters. From the great height and extent of the piles of debris, and from the occasional sight of the splintered cornice of a roof or of some battered window frame or door, I knew that this had once been a city, one of the world's greatest. But no other recognizable feature remained amid the gray masses of ruins, and the very streets and avenues had been erased. But here and there a tremendous crater, 300 feet across, 100 to 150 feet deep, indicated the source of destruction. As if to reinforce the dread idea that had taken possession of my brain, one of the comet-like red prodigies went streaking across the sky even as I gazed down at the dead city, and I knew, as clearly as if I had seen the whole spectacle with my own eyes, that the missile had sprung from a source hundreds or thousands of miles away, possibly across the ocean, and that, laden with scores and tons of explosives, it had been hurled with unerring mechanical accuracy upon its mission of annihilation. Then I seemed to float over vast distances of that sunset-tinted land, and saw great craters in the fields, and villages shot to ribbons, and farms abandoned, and the wild dogs fought for the wild cattle, and thistles grew deep on acres where wheat had been planted, and weeds sprouted thickly in the orchards, and blights and mildew competed for the crops. But through here and there I could see a dugout, with traces of fire and abandoned tools flung about at random. Nowhere in all that dismal world did I observe a living man. After a time I returned to a place near the ruined city by the two rivers, and in the rocky palisades above one of the streams I made out some small circular holes barely large enough to admit a man. And, borne onwards by some impulse of curiosity and despair, I entered one of these holes and went downward, far downward into the dim recesses. And now, for the first time, at a depth of hundreds of yards, I did at last encounter living men. My first thought was that I had gone back to the day of the caveman, for a cave-like hollow had been scooped out in the solid rock. It was true that the few hundreds of people huddled together there had the dress and looks of moderns. It was true also that the gloom was lighted for them by electric bulbs, and that electric radiators kept them warm. Yet Dante himself, in painting the ninth circle of his Inferno, could not have imagined a drearier and more despondent group than these that slouched and drooped and muttered in that cavernous recess, seated with their heads fallen low upon their knees, or moodily pacing back and forth like captives who can hope for no escape. "Here, at least, we will be safe from the sky marauders," I heard one of them muttering. Yet I could not help wondering what the mere safety of the body could mean when all the glories of man's civilization were annihilated. There came a whirring in my head and another blank interval, and when I regained my senses I knew that another period of time had passed, possibly months or even years. I stood on the palisade above the river near the entrance of the caves, and the sun was bright above me, but there was no brightness in the men and women that trailed out of a small circular hole in the ground. drab as dock rats and pasty pale of countenance as hospital inmates, with bent backs and dirty, tattered clothes in a mouse-like nosing manner. They emerged with the wariness of hunted refugees, and they flung up their hands with low cries to shield them from the brilliance of the sun, to which they were evidently unaccustomed. From the packs on their backs and the bundles in their hands, I knew that they were emerging from their subterranean refuge to try to begin a new life in the ravaged world above. My heart went out to them, for I saw that, few as they were, not more than 50 in all, they were the sole survivors of a once populous region, would have a bitter fight to wage in the man-made wilderness that had been a world metropolis. But as they roamed above through the waste of ash and rubble, and as they wandered abroad where the fields had been and saw how every brush and tree had been seared from the earth or poisoned by chemical brews, I knew that their fight was not merely a bitter one, it was hopeless. As I heard them muttering among themselves, "We have not even any tools," and again, "We have no fuel left for the great machines," for they had lived in a highly mechanical world, and the technicians who alone understood the workings of that world had all been destroyed. The sources of power had all been cut off, and power was food without which they would not long survive.
"Stand by to reduce speed 3/4!" roared Major Connell.
Aye, aye, sir,
replied Tom, and began the necessary adjustments on the control panel. He spoke into the intercom.
Control deck to power deck. Stand by to reduce thrust on main drive rockets by 3/4. We're coming onto the space station, Astro.
Power deck aye,
Acknowledged Astro. Drifting in a steady orbit around its mother planet, the Venus space station loomed ahead of the Polaris like a huge metal ball set against a backdrop of cold, black space. It was studded with gaping holes, airlocks which served as landing ports for spaceships. Inside the station was a compact city. Living quarters, communication rooms, repair shops, weather observations, meteor information, everything to serve the great fleet of the Solar Guard and merchant spaceships plying the space lanes between Earth, Mars, Venus and Titan.
I'm getting the identification request from the station, sir. Shall I answer her?
Asked Roger over the intercom.
Of course, you space-brained idiot! And make it fast!
Exploded Connell.
What do you want to do? Get us blasted out of space?
Yes, sir.
Replied Roger.
Right away, sir.
Tom kept his eyes on the teleceiver screen above his head. The image of the space station loomed large and clear.
Approaching a little too fast, I think, sir.
Volunteered Tom.
Shall I make the adjustment?
What's the range?
Asked Connell. Tom named a figure. Mused Connell. He glanced quickly over the dials and then nodded in assent. Tom turned once more to the intercom.
Control deck to power deck,
he called.
Stand by for maneuvering, Astro, and reduce your main drive thrust to minimum space speed.
Space station traffic control to rocket cruiser Polaris. Come in, Polaris. This is traffic control on space station to Polaris.
The audio teleceiver crackled.
Rocket cruiser Polaris to space station and traffic control. Request touchdown permission and landing port number,
replied Tom.
Permission to touchdown granted, Polaris. You are to line up and approach to landing port 7. Repeat 7. I'm now sending out guiding radar beam. Can you read beam?
Tom turned to the intercom.
Have you got the station's guiding beam, Roger?
All lined up, Tom.
Replied Roger from the radar bridge.
Get that Venusian on the power deck to give me a 3-second shot on the starboard rocket, if he can find the right handles.
I heard that, Manning.
Roared Astro's voice on the intercom.
Another crack like that and I'll make you get out and push this baby around.
You execute that order! And do it! Blast it, quick!
Major Connell's voice exploded over the intercom.
And watch that loose talk on the ship's intercom. From now on, all directions and orders will be given and received in a crisp, clear manner, without unnecessary familiarity.
Connell didn't expect them to acknowledge his order. The cadets had heard him, and that was enough. He knew it was enough. In the short time it had taken them to traverse the immense gulf of space between the Academy and the station, Connell had handed out demerits by 5s and 10s. Each of the cadets was now tagged with enough black marks to spend 2 months in the galley working them off. Now working together like the smooth team of junior spacemen they were, Tom, Roger and Astro manoeuvred the great rocket ship toward the gaping hole of the airlock in the side of the white ball-like satellite.
Drop your bow 1/2 degree, Polaris. You're up too high,
warned the station control.
A short burst on the upper trim rocket, Astro,
called Tom. The great ship bucked slightly under the force of a sudden thrust, and then its nose dropped the required 1/2 degree.
Cut all thrust and break your speed to dead ship, Polaris.
Ordered traffic control. Again, Tom relayed the order to Astro, and a moment later the great ship hung silently in the airless void of space, a scant half-mile from the station. Through the teleceiver, Tom could see the jet boats darting out from the station carrying the magnetic cables. In a moment, the lines were attached to the steel skin of the ship, and gradually the lines tightened, pulling the mighty spaceship into the waiting port. Once inside, the outer airlock was closed, and the Polaris was slung in the powerful magnetic cradles that held her in a rigid position. Elsewhere on the satellite, quick calculations were made for the additional weight, and the station was counterbalanced to assure an even orbit around Venus. Tom flicked the many switches off on the great board, glanced at the time of arrival on the solar clock, and reported to Major Connell.
Touchdown at 1949, sir.
Very well, Corbett.
Answered Connell. Then he added grudgingly,
That was as fine a job of control deck operations as I've seen. Keep up the good work, spaceman.
Tom gulped. The unexpected compliment caught him off guard, and he was even more pleased that for the first time Connell had referred to him as spaceman.
I'll be needed at the space station commander's quarters for a while, Corbett,
said Connell.
Meanwhile, you and Manning and Astro acquaint yourselves with the station. Report to me back aboard the ship in exactly 2 hours. Dismissed!
Tom saluted, and Connell disappeared toward the exit port.
Well, spaceman,
Roger drawled casually from behind.
it looks like you've got yourself in solid with the old man.
Tom smiled.
With a guy like that, Roger, you're never in solid. Maybe I did get a pat on the back, but you didn't hear him cancel any of those demerits he gave me for not signing the logbook after that last watch, did you?
Let's get some chow.
Growled Astro, who came hustling through the hatch.
I'm half starved. By the craters of Luna, how many times can you change course in 5 minutes?
Astro referred to the countless times Tom had had to call for fraction-degree course changes in their approach to the gaping entrance port. Tom laughed.
With Connell on the bridge, you're lucky I didn't give you twice as many,
he replied.
Can you imagine what would have happened if we had missed and hit the station?
Rrr, shuddered Roger.
I hate to think about it. Come on, let's rustle up some grub for the Venusian. I could use some myself.
The three boys quickly changed to their dress blue cadet uniforms and left the ship. A moment later, they were being whisked up to an electric elevator to the main, or street, level. The door opened and they stepped out into a large circular area about the size of a city block in the rear of the station. The area had been broken into smaller sections. One side of the street was devoted to shops, a small stereo house which had played the latest Liddy Tamil hit Children of Space, a sensational drama about the lives of men in the future, restaurants, and even a curio shop. The Venus space station handled 90% of the traffic into and out of Venusport. It was a refueling stop for the jetliners and space freighters bound for the other planets and for those returning to Earth. Some ships went directly to Venusport for heavy overhaul or supplies, but the station was established primarily for quick turnarounds. Several ex-enlisted spacemen who had been injured or retired were given special permission to open shops for the convenience of the passengers and crews of the ships and the staff of the station. In 20 years, the station had become a place where summer tourists from Earth and winter tourists from Titan made a point of stopping. The first of its kind in the universe, it was as near as a perfect place to live as could be built by man. Tom, Roger and Astro strolled down the short street, pushing through a crowd of tourists admiring the shops. Finally, they found a restaurant that specialised in Venusian dishes.
Now you two spindly Earthmen are going to have the best meal of your lives. Broiled dinosaur on real Venusian black bread.
Dinosaur?
Stuttered Tom in amazement.
Why, that's a prehistoric monster.
Yeah, Astro.
Agreed Roger.
What are you trying to hand us?
Astro laughed.
You'll see, fellas,
he replied.
I used to go hunting for them when I was a kid. Brought the best price of any wild game. 50 credits for babies under £300. Over that, you can't eat them. Too tough.
Tom and Roger looked at each other, eyes bulging.
Ah, come on, Tom.
Drawled Roger.
He's just trying to pull our leg.
Without a word, Astro grabbed them by the arms and rushed them into the restaurant. They were no sooner seated when a recorded voice announced the menu over a small loudspeaker on the table. Astro promptly ordered dinosaur, and to his unit mate's amazement, the voice politely inquired,
"Would the spaceman prefer to have it broiled a la Venusian black bread, baked or raw?"
A sharp look from Roger and Tom Tom, and Astro ordered it broiled. 1 hour and 15 minutes later, the 3 members of the Polaris unit staggered out of the restaurant.
By the rings of Saturn,
Declared Tom.
that wasn't only the most I ever ate. Oh, it was the best.
Roger nodded in silent agreement, leaning against the plastic window in the front of the restaurant.
You see?
Astro beamed.
Maybe you guys will listen to me from now on.
Boy, I can't wait to see Mum's face when I tell her that her chicken and dumplings have taken second place to broiled monster.
By the jumping blazes of the stars.
Yelled Roger suddenly.
Look at the time. We're 10 minutes late.
Oh,
Moaned Tom.
I knew it was too good to be true.
Step on it.
Said Astro.
Maybe he won't notice.
Some chance.
Groaned Roger, running after Tom and Astro.
That old rocket head wouldn't miss anything.
The 3 boys raced back to the electric elevator and were silently whisked to the airlock level. They hurried aboard the Polaris and into the control room. Major Connell was seated in a chair near the chart screen, studying some papers. The cadets drew themselves to attention.
A unit reporting for duty, sir.
Tom quavered. Connell spun around in the swivel chair, glanced at the clock, put the papers to one side, and slowly advanced toward the cadets.
13.5 minutes late!
He said, dropping his voice to a biting growl.
I'll give you 5 seconds to think of a good excuse. Every man is entitled to an excuse. Some have good ones, some have truthful ones, and some have excuses that sound as though they made them up in 5 seconds.
He eyed the cadets speculatively.
Well?
He demanded.
I'm afraid we were carried away by our enthusiasm for a meal Astro introduced us to, sir.
Said Tom honestly.
All right,
Snapped Connell.
then here's something else to carry you all away.
He paused and rocked on the balls of his feet.
I had planned to give you 3 liberty of the station while here, whenever you weren't working on the new transmitter. But since you have shown yourselves to be carried away so easily, I don't think I can depend on you completing your regular duties. Therefore, I suggest that each of you report to the officer in charge of your respective departments and learn the operation and function of the station while we're here. This work will be in addition to your assigned duties on the new transmitter operation.
The 3 cadets gulped but were silent.
Not only that,
Connell's voice had risen to an angry bark.
but you will be logged a demerit apiece for each minute you reported late. 13.5 minutes! 13.5 demerits!
The gold and black of the Solar Guard uniform never looked more ominous as the 3 cadets watched the stern spaceman turn and stomp out the exit port. Alone, their liberty taken away from them before they even knew they had it, the boys sat around on the control deck of the silent ship and listened to the distant throb of a pump, rising and falling, pumping free air throughout the station.
Well,
Sighed Tom.
I always did want to know how a space station worked. Now I guess I'll learn firsthand.
Me too.
Said Astro. He propped his big feet up on a delicate instrument panel of the control board.
Me too.
Sneered Roger, his voice filled with a bitterness that surprised Tom and Astro.
But I didn't think I would find out like this. How in the universe has that tyrant managed to stay alive this long?